Hello and welcome to episode 76 Space Technology and Business Developments in South Korea. We have almost discussed most of the Asia and the Pacific region as well about the space development, but the East Asian focus has not been so much covered on this podcast. Primarily Japan, South Korea, as well as several other countries in the region. And today we are kickstarting with that process where we are, covering a dedicated episode on the space developments in South Korea. So without any delay, I would like to welcome Antonio Stark. Hi, Antonio, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Omkar, thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you very much. Likewise, and it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast because I've been following your work for several years. We have been part of SGSC as well, and it's finally great to have you on the podcast. So, before we take a jump into the topic itself, can you briefly provide an outlook on your journey in the space industry? How you basically started? What is your academic background, and how you ended up doing what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, always going for the hardest questions first. My journey
Yeah.
here was definitely not the most conventional. I actually graduated, my degrees were in business and computational sciences. I actually studied artificial intelligence and machine learning, but I've always been doing space, been involved in the space sector in one capacity or another. So in my past lives, I've done a lot of different things like startup accelerators and sustainability and policy work. I'm now more fully into the commercial space sector. So right now I do a bunch of other things, but right now I am mainly known for my work at Spacewatch Global Media Firm, where I'm working as Asia Pacific editor. So I take care of newsworthy items over here in the Asia Pacific relating to space. I also work in a variety of non-government organizations in the space sector, like Space Generation Advisory Council, Moon Village Association, Space Corp Foundation, National Space Society, etc. So very good to be here. So with a fellow space professional who's been in the sector for decades.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting journey with quite a lot of interdisciplinary approach, I would say. And coming straight to the point of our actual topic of the podcast. So, how has South Korea's space technology landscape evolved in the recent years, and what are the key drivers behind this growth? Because we have seen since Washington has, taken out all the sanctions from the missile restrictions, I would say, and since then, South Korea has been progressing quite a lot in the space industry. So, from that perspective, what is your complete take on this issue of, the evolvement and the kind of progress that South Korea is experiencing at the moment in the space domain?
Absolutely. And I think everyone would know that South Korea is very heavy on the defense side of things, primarily because of our location. I mean, on
Yes.
one side, we definitely have North Korea right up to against their border, but also we are right next door neighbors to China and Japan to the west and east, respectively. And we're also one of the strongest allies of the United States in the Asia Pacific region. So defense takes up a big toll and segment of the Korean economy and the community in general. Specifically for space, we have had a somewhat interesting relationship with the US. On one side, we're very much dependent on US technologies to provide us with a defense umbrella, including the space domain. At the same time, the US has had restrictions on some capabilities being developed domestically within Korea, especially the one you mentioned, which was regarding missile technologies. We were not able to develop launch technologies above a certain capability before. That has more or less been bypassed with the development of the KSLV-2, the Korea Space Launch Vehicle 2 rocket, which is definitely above that restriction line that we used to have before. And so on I think 80-90% of the time, we are on good terms with the US on security and technology cooperation, but to 10 to 20% of the time, the Korean government does try to identify ways of having independent technological might in regards to space. Is the point here is that when you are looking at the South Korean space sector, it's very difficult to see it separately from the defense and security sector because the two are so heavily meshed. It's heavily meshed everywhere, but it's more so in Korea than other countries where they enjoy a more peaceful security environment.
Interesting. And coming to the point, basically, looking at the kind of niche expertise of every country, because I believe every country has several expertise, and I think in European region we see a component and supply chain. Then in India, the launch expertise that we are seeing at the moment. In US, of course, it's a deep space exploration and all. In Australia, we see the same thing again, deep space exploration. So with that perspective, what are the significant technology advancements coming out of South Korea's space sector? I mean, as you mentioned, defense. So is it something like, military space applications is something that might be the focus of South Korea in the coming years?
There are multiple sides of the space sector. I think everyone would agree. A big fancy part of it is definitely launch vehicles. South Korea has tried to take in its bite out of the launch market in like honestly all countries. The launch big payload launch capability does need to come start off from the government side. It was so in the US, it was so for a lot of other countries, and except for very, very few countries like New Zealand, all launcher projects just has to come from the government because such a long time development, and very difficult to see cash flow early on. That's why for Korea, we had the KSLV-2 project that was initially developed in cooperation with the Russians, because the US was, due to our current restriction, we cannot provide you with any missile-related technologies. So South Korea went over to Russia to learn rocket engines, etc., into building our KSLV launcher series. Now we have done that. Now we have successfully put a satellite. Now we have successfully put satellites into orbit using that launcher. Now that's been done and the national fame is claimed, the Korean government now doesn't really see a lot of value in trying to manage that project slash program because it is very, very expensive to try to maintain launch facilities and technologies and the people. So it has, at least for the KSLV program, they're now offloading it to a private company, the Hanwha Aerospace company, which is the largest defense corporation here in South Korea. But again, this is all pertaining only to the launcher side of business. For the satellite side of business, is a bit different, and of course, it's segmented very clearly into the large satellites versus small CubeSats. The large satellites are still very much government dependent or government technology spin-off. All the companies, they're actually not many, like two at most, perhaps three, but basically two companies that can manufacture heavy payload spacecraft, and they are either government agencies such as Kari, or they are defense contractors, which are building satellites with either purely for the security reasons or for dual use reasons. If you look at pure commercial players in the satellite market, they are focusing. I mean, their capabilities are purely for the CubeSat era. The current leader in satellites, I mean, in small satellites in Korea, is a 12U CubeSat unit. And apart from satellites and launchers, we do have some segment in the ground station arena. There is one company that does maintain a very wide ground station network around the world. So in looking at the Korean space sector, you can very clearly see that there's not that many players, and the big players are still very much government contract sourced.
Interesting. And just I would say, taking a step ahead into this topic, basically, you mentioned about the government's outlook on the sector as well. So, can you describe the role of private companies in South Korea's space sector and how they are contributing to technological advancement? Because we have seen there are companies like InnoSpace and several other players which are coming up in the market at the moment. So, from looking at the complete perspective of the progress that is happening around the world, what are your thoughts on South Korea's private sector in general?
Sure. So the commercial companies are growing, have grown a lot in the past 10 years mostly. There were some space companies that existed prior to the last 10 years, but they weren't growing so rapidly as they have been in the last 10 years. And even then, they were, again, still much very government dependent for a lot of the funding sources, even for pure commercial players. They all needed to start their funding streams from the government. And that's been very helpful because the government did identify space as a vertical that it wants to focus on, especially in the last two administrations. That's when different government agencies, such as Small Business Ministry or the Ministry of Science and Technology, has really put in a lot of money into just backing space companies. So the roots were definitely there. Technologies are maturing. Defense companies are, of course, already sharing a lot of technologies with the government and the defense and the military sector. Commercial companies are developing a lot of their technologies, but a lot of them did start off from research side of things. If you do look into the backgrounds of a lot of the founders, etc., they start off a lot of these projects from universities, usually advanced degrees, advanced research institutes such as CARI or KAIST, and projects that started off from government research institutes then get spun off into independent commercial entities is what we've so far seen. In terms of technology, they are progressing well. Definitely not
Yeah,
as fast as everyone wants, but definitely faster than what you would see in comparable other countries in the region. Like if you look at Philippines, Indonesia, or Taiwan, South Korea's commercial growth, while not as fast as American ones, are still faster because the government has explicitly identified space as a growth strategy. It has given some clear milestones for a lot of these companies to attain. It did set out a few good goals for the government that the government wants to achieve. And that just sets out, milestones that the companies can talk about and which the investors can go around with. The government funding is one source, but investor funding does need to come around to commercial companies. And without government milestones, it's really hard for these investors to kind of prospect into the future. So government having that strategy out in public and pushing it across multiple ministries and not just by a single ministry, that really sends a strong signal for the investors and has been a huge help for the companies in acquiring the necessary talent in enough quantity to get the technology that we need.
interesting. And I would say looking at the complete outlook that you have mentioned at the moment, and the kind of money that is pumped into the market. So taking a little bit step back at the, I would say, achievements and looking at the history of South Korea. So what impact has Nuri rocket program had on the development of South Korea's space technology and in general the complete business ecosystem?
It has been a source of national pride, very much so for this generation. The last big milestone that we had in space technology was our astronaut program. South Korea only has one astronaut so far, which is Dr. Soyeon Yi. And that was an incredibly successful mission. Dr. Yi stayed in the International Space Station via the Russian route. She went up using the Soyuz, but again, because it was not an entirely Korean mission, I mean, like we still went above the Soyuz and not on our own rocket. It wasn't as much of a national pride as some people wanted. In comparison, the Nudie program, while having Russian influence, and technological support is still more seen as an entirely Korean program, and for which we did have a lot more support and applause by the Korean citizens. So on one side, it's been really helpful in just advising to the public that South Korea is serious about space and that we want to go there and that we're actually putting money behind it and that we actually have the technologies for it. A lot of South Korean people pride ourselves as a technological nation because we have companies like Samsung and Hyundai
Yes.
here, and having the Nuri rocket has been a source of great national pride. On the other side, there has been some criticism, like all countries, on whether or not this is something that we want to spend so much money on. And that's honestly primarily why the Korean government has decided so quickly to turn around the Nuri program over to the commercial sector and discontinue managing the Nuri program directly after a few launches so far. So that has been I think, in my personal opinion, South Korea has done a very great job on that balance of a government to private ratio. The government supported us far enough that it became a source of national pride, but not so far that people began questioning the relevance of taxpayer money being spent on something that does not bring immediate value to the people, to the public.
Okay. Yep. I mean, like you mentioned about this immediate value, so I got a little bit curious. And as you mentioned that you yourself are also working in the commercial sector at the moment. So how is South Korea basically leveraging satellite technology for commercial applications? And what are the potential emerging opportunities that you see from your perspective? Might not be only for the commercial applications, but it can be for even civil or military. So please feel free to mention the way you feel from your perspective are the kind of emerging opportunities for the people in the space sector of South Korea.
Sure. So there are business sides of it and there's the government sides of it. And the business side, South Korea does try to sell spacecraft and satellites to other countries and other clients and say, hey, you want a satellite, you can get it manufactured here. South Korea is a kind of like good go-between when you want a satellite. It's not going to be as cheap as, for example, if you want to try to make it in India, but it will be cheaper than, for example, you're trying to go from Japan. And for that, South Korea has identified a lot of niche markets in the global space sector, especially from the Middle East. So I think you already know that Middle East does have a lot of money to spend. It does want to see itself in the space ecosystem, but super big players in Europe and the US and Japan does tend to get costly. And especially in the Middle East, they do want to see a balance between quantity and quality. They don't necessarily need they don't necessarily need to see a multi-year project with the highest quality spacecraft that will be delivered after 10 years. They more want more satellites in shorter amount of time that comes more at a budget, but is still more reliable than perhaps the ones that you would get um, from the very cheapest side of the sector. And for that day, a lot of those customers are looking into Korea for both launch systems and satellites. And you'll see that in the sales contracts that were signed between Middle East and the prominent satellite companies and the launch companies that we have here in Korea. So that's on the commercial side of things. On the government side of things, the government is very strategically using our technological prowess as a diplomatic as a diplomatic token. So South Korea does have a very active educational program of educating developing country engineers, especially on satellite technologies. We have an annual program that invites these engineers over to Korea to learn about satellite technologies and then bring them back and this program has been going on for quite a few years, and we are already seeing a lot of good success because the engineers who were educated in Korea about space technology now went on into becoming key figures in their own national space ecosystems. And when they are looking at contracts to buy for satellites, they are definitely considering South Korean suppliers more than perhaps you would for maybe Indian or Japanese suppliers.
Interesting. And I think that's a very interesting things that you mentioned at the moment, especially about the Middle East. So I would like to, kind of take a little bit jump from the national space goals to the international one. So can you also briefly discuss the collaborations between South Korean companies and the international partners, which are basically helping them advance the technology?
There are some, I'm not at freedom to talk everything that I know about, but there are some international cooperation going on. And this is where the relationship with the government actually gets a bit tenuous. So the good thing about the Korean government is that it has a very clear goal of a space program that it wants to achieve until the year 2030s. But at the same time, it does want the companies to focus only on those goals. And while it is attractive to a lot of investors and having such clear goals laid out until 2030s, a lot of these companies can't wait until that timeline. And some of these companies are looking into having opportunities nearer term in order to validate their solutions to customers and especially to international customers. Having good contracts by the Korean government is good, but actually having successful missions flown is a much better win. And we don't really see immediate missions coming up for the Korean government, for which a lot of the commercial players are rather discreetly courting foreign customers for a faster project delivery date. So, for example, on InnoSpace, they went on all the way over to Brazil to test their
Yes.
rocket out because it was kind of very difficult to try to find a method to do so in such a near term in Korea. Contact the ground stations company also has a larger overseas market portfolio than a domestic market portfolio simply because the greater segment of the market exists there, and the Korean government hasn't
Yes.
really been concentrating on ground operations segments. And even for if you look at lunar programs, and I'm mentioning lunar programs here because international corporations do become more apparent when you go beyond Earth orbit and looking
Yes.
at Artemis Accords, etc. Korea does have a very good lunar program, but again, those missions are slated only for 2032 and beyond. Like it says 2032, but we all kind of think and kind of expect that it will be delayed. A lot of these companies simply don't have the cash flow to wait out that long. They would look into potential buyers abroad to be able to fulfill the nearer term goals, but they need to balance that against scrutiny of the Korean government because, of course, the Korean government would prefer these companies' first projects to be done domestically, but that Korea does not have a domestic market mature enough for that yet, and also we simply don't have the infrastructure to do so. If you simply look at launch services, our only operating launch pad is over in the southern tip of Korea, which is very difficult to get to, and honestly offers a very, very narrow angle window of launch trajectories. So, and the rules are not really there. It's a very, very small and contested airspace. We don't have a lot of satellites. Like we don't have a lot of companies or clients that require full-on satellite services. So again, it's natural that these companies would want to look at foreign customers, but also natural for the Korean government to not prefer commercial companies to do so.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for this extended perspective. And I would say, I mean, this many things are going on. You mentioned some of the briefly challenges also you mentioned, I believe. But still, from a general perspective, I believe if someone is an investor or some people would like to basically, start something of their own again as an entrepreneur, because we have always seen that historically, South Korea has been one of the prominent nations, not in the technology, but into the entrepreneurship as well. It has been encouraging businesses worldwide, whether it's cosmetics or anything else in the food industry as well. Entrepreneurship is something that has always been encouraged. So, from that perspective, in general manner, from your perspective and your general experience in the industry, what are the challenges faced by the South Korean businesses in the space sector, and how they can potentially be overcome, or what are the possible solutions that you feel that might be overcome in the future?
Great question. And honestly, I believe it comes down to language. It comes down to barriers. So all the companies that operate in Korea in the space sector know that if they want to grow, if they want to scale, they need to grow beyond the Korean border. The
Yes.
Korean market is just way too small. If you look at like there's simply no pot. We don't have a market big enough to satisfy sustained growth for any companies here in Korea. That's
Yes.
why South Korea traditionally has been driven very much on export allowable businesses. This is again very difficult when you are a defense contractor because defense systems are very hard to export due to international regulations, international laws, and just a lot more scrutiny in import-export control. So a lot of the companies know that it needs to start preparing its products to an international customer right now. But
Yes.
South Korea, due to its significant language barrier and due to a lot of the people not being able to speak fluent English, has a very big barrier when it comes to approaching customers. And also our culture is also significantly different to those of other countries, which also makes for different teams. Like your sales team not only need to speak two different language, but also it needs to adapt to two different types of cultures. Like in Korea, you can just like go out for drinks. You can just be polite and follow up in a lot of ways, in indirect ways, and hope for a contract to mature. While in more direct Western cultures, you need to be going out and about, going out to a lot of conventions and expos, getting your products to a lot of the customers, and being direct. So being able to maintain teams that can manage both cultures at such an early stage is a difficulty, which is a difficulty that is shared by China and Japan, our culturally similar countries, but the difficulty is not as severe in China and Japan. For China, when you look at anything import export, the government has a centralized way of doing things that the company doesn't need to worry so much about it. Like just go alongside the government. The Chinese government will just host all the necessary conventions. It would talk to all the relevant embassies for you. It would already find and source relevant customers. All you need to do is to just attend the meetings and you're set, more or less. For Japan, you do have a more significant language and cultural barrier. At the same time, Japan also has a much bigger domestic market. The companies in Japan can wait until they become bigger before having to deal with the internationalization challenges. Japan has so much bigger population than South Korea. It has so much more land mass and maritime regions than South Korea. It has a huge telecommunications market, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have to worry about globalization so early on. For South Korea, startups that is just 20 to 30 to 50 people large already needs to worry about globalization and already needs to worry about attracting talent that can manage and handle both cultures, which is really, really expensive. And that's a challenge that is not so well supported by the government. The government does support startups domestically, but because it also wants these companies to service the domestic sector before going international, it doesn't support companies going abroad as much as China would. So here you would kind of see the dilemma that these companies have, in that the Korean government is a great supporter in the initial setup, but it also becomes somewhat of a growth limiting factor when these companies want to set out a longer term strategy into integrating themselves into the international ecosystem.
That's a good, and I would say a detailed perspective. And I hope, I think the situation changes. But the language barrier thing, I can actually relate. And as an Indian residing in France and working in the European space industry, I can very much relate to the language barriers. But I hope, the globalization thing doesn't get limited. It keeps on expanding. And I believe we are almost at the end of the podcast at the moment. This question, I would say, is related to primarily, the future aspect. So, looking ahead, what are the major trends and future directions in South Korea's space technology and business landscape that you observe or you feel that might change in the coming years, or might basically set Korea on a path where things will be, kind of benchmarking, and the country will be establishing itself as one of the prime space powers in the world? What are those
Absolutely.
things? Yep.
Right. And I think the immediate answer that comes to mind is coordination and cooperation. So for the Korean government has been somewhat fragmented because we didn't have a central point of contact for space services. It was split between KARI, the aerospace the Aerospace Institute in Korea, and KASI, the Space Science and Astronomy Institute in Korea. They have been split, and they were also both managed under the Ministry of Science and Technology. And technological development was also split between these institutes, as well as research, or like non-government research institutes, and the private sector. It was very, very segmentized and separated because there was no center point. Our hope is that with the introduction of the Korean Space Agency, KASA, literally just a few months ago, we would have a better center point of coordination. We are already seeing that the government has been publishing more strategy documents and strategy milestones up and coming, but still it is a hard task up ahead. Even in last year, when Korea became a signatory to the Artemis Accords, we already had political infighting within the government itself between the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And that's already been a conflict that's been ongoing for the last 5 to 10 years on, if you want to go international, do you talk with the MOFA or do you talk with MSID? And we are hoping that with CASA, it would lead to uh the integration of those conflicts, rather than CASA being one more contestant in this political quandary that we find ourselves in. So we do need more coordination and cooperation amongst all government players if Korea does want to be a global player. I can't tell you specifics, but I have worked on quite a few government projects where the lack of coordination within the Korean government has been a significant hindrance for foreign governments trying to work with Korea. It's just incredibly difficult to work with the Korean government for anything long term, because the Korean government would say different things about what it wants to achieve and how it can supply them, because different ministries want different things for itself. So hopefully with CASA, we can have more uniformity, more continuity that would allow South Korea to be more involved in these type of international agreements and projects. On the commercial side, we need cooperation coordination because the market is so small. Satellites and launch services are one of the most contested areas in the space sector, and South Korea already has several of them. They're all competing against each other at the same time. In order to have South Korean technology up in the market, they also need to cooperate with each other in just saying, hey, this is a great opportunity. If there's a launch contract that can be potentially sourced by South Korea, would all three South Korean companies go after the same contract? Or will the government kind of come in and mediate between those companies and say, hey, let's try to be cooperative. Let's not try to fight our own budgets against each other in finding that one contract. So successful coordination and cooperation within the private sector is also gonna be really important if they want to expand. They really need to know that infighting within the very, very small Korean market is simply not gonna help anyone. Like, the gains are not worth the risks and the cost that it would bring them. They all need to fight more openly and fairly in the international market. But in order to be introduced to the international market, they need to first learn how to cooperate with themselves as a whole Korea team, single Korea team and Korea face. The Korean government hasn't done the best job in putting that face forward. Hopefully, we will see something that is more initiated by the businesses themselves in trying to put forward a Korea space, in putting forward a commercial Korean space sector out there in the market that allows them to be branded together and compete for contracts and win them successfully.
Interesting. And the final question that we are having on this episode, uh, I would say this is not related to our topic, but it is related to the students, because they're apart from the industry experts, the government agencies, the commercial companies in the space industry, defense industry. Uh, there is a significant amount of students who actually listen to this podcast. So I believe every expert who comes on this podcast, every research scholars who comes on this podcast has something to offer to the students in terms of anecdotes or a kind of guidance. So this last question is not related to our topic, but it is related to completely, your own perspective and what you would like to basically tell to the students. So what message, Antonio, you would like to give to the research scholars, students, or even the non-space industry experts who are trying to make their way in the space industry?
Right. I would say find your own niche, which was my way of entering this sector and being able to propel myself forward a lot. I think the US has done an incredible job of inspiring the next generation of astronomers, of aerospace engineers, and astronauts. At the same time, it's a very US centric model. And even for the US, those models are becoming obsolete with the new space era coming in. A lot of the next gen researchers and students and young professionals I see are very have a very limited scope of what they want to be able to achieve, that is so much primarily driven only by the American model. The American model is not only outdated, but also not applicable. You cannot be a military pilot in order to be an astronaut. You cannot go on and do aerospace engineering, bachelor's, master's, and PhD all your life and make a name for yourself. The current environment requires someone with diplomatic skills, project management skills, engineering skills, software and management skills, all rolled into one. You can't get degrees in all of these, but you can definitely get experience in a lot of these. And that's something that we have never seen a good role model for. But it's a talent that every company needs right now. And the companies know it. They're trying to find people. When I talk to all the CEOs of space startups out there, is that they simply can't hire enough people that they need. But also when I talk to the students, they also can't find enough companies that are willing to hire them. And that's because there's this gap in the market. The students are training themselves in the very narrow segments that they have seen on Hollywood movies of what NASA researchers are doing, and they're only training themselves in those segments. While the space startup CEOs need people with a wider discipline of skill sets, and they're not finding enough people that tick off all their check marks. So if the students and researchers can really go in and be able to identify what their niche area is, that is not simply aerospace engineering, then you'll find yourself suddenly catapulted into the valued side of the talent pool because you have had such experiences. And stop looking only at NASA, ESA, ISRO, etc. If you look at other countries like the Philippines or Korea, there are multiple programs that you can get involved in where you can get experience in a lot faster, but because people simply want brand recognition, they they just get so tied up on it. The thing is, um these brands, they are powerful, but they're also so many. If you go look at the market, the number of people who have worked in NASA, the number of people who have worked at SpaceX are staggering. Like there's so many people who have worked in NASA, so many people who have worked in SpaceX before. And people are thinking like NASA and SpaceX are their only dreams and everything else doesn't count. It's not. You need to start yourself at companies in Korea, companies in India, or companies in Malaysia or Indonesia or the Philippines, get experience in international project management, international sales, in policy trainings, and then you'll see suddenly that a lot of companies want to hire you, and that's where the future lies. 10, 20 years down the ladder, SpaceX will still be relevant, NASA will still be relevant, but again, you don't want to work in SpaceX 20 years from now. You want to work at SpaceX what it was 10 years ago. And you need to find the will be SpaceX right now, and just tying yourself up with the big companies right now would make them lose the opportunity to work with the potential big companies that are just very dying of trying to hire talent. So that would be my advice to the young researchers and students.
Thank you very much, Antonio. I agree with most of your part that, I believe the skill set is very important. We really need skill set that is not only of engineering, but something, in diplomacy, law, policy as well. And I hope really in the coming years, things change with the kind of dynamics. And you mentioned about the movies as well. So I think the entertainment serves as a kind of inspiration or sometimes a trigger point to kind of start a way of innovation or the kind of talent pool creation. So I hope in the near future this will also change the way we are going in the space industry and the way things are becoming much more visible to the commercial space industry. And I believe throughout this conversation there are several questions which have popped up, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to receive a lot of emails and messages from the listeners. And I hope in the near future we'll be able to address those questions, looking at the kind of response that we are having at the moment for the podcast. I hope to record more episodes with you in the future. Thank you very much, Antonio.
Absolutely. And again, for any listeners out there, if they want to contact me or give me any feedback or any of your personal thoughts on what I said here in this episode, please let them know that they are very welcome to contact me over on LinkedIn and Instagram. I use both platforms very actively for different reasons. If you want to just see more of my personal growth journey and see more of what I do in in space robotics and satellites and in many other fields in space, you can find them on my Instagram page. If you want to get more professional advice and connected more to my professional opinions in the space sector, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I'll be entering those details at the podcast description. Yes, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you, Omkar.
Yes.